Welcome back to the Female Athlete Inner Circle, the online vault for female athletes, coaches, and parents. The goal is to educate and to start a conversation about topics surrounding female athletes. Today, my guest is Beth Mayer. We have had Beth on the Women's Basketball Summit, and she actually spoke recently on the Female Athlete Summit, and we had a hard conversation about suicide. And in light of what's happened with two big people committing suicide in the recent months, I wanted to have Beth back on the call to kind of just continue this conversation. So Beth, welcome to the call, my friend.
Hi, thank you, Jen.
Beth, it's always a pleasure to sit down and talk shop with you. So if people haven't heard your interviews in the past, let's tell them a little bit about yourself.
Okay, so I'm currently the executive director of the Multi-Service Eating Disorder Association. It's an organization that works with all different types of folks that struggle with eating disorders and body image in Newtonville. I also have a private practice where my specialty is working with anybody that struggles with body image eating disorders, and I particularly work with lots of athletes.
Nice. And how long have you been doing this, Beth?
So I've been doing my private practice and been in the field for over 30 years. And I've been at medicine since its inception 23 years ago, but I've been employed here for about 17 years.
Nice. And Beth will be stepping down the end of August. This will air in the Inner Circle the beginning of August. But we want to make sure we talk about Meta. It's a great organization. They do wonderful work with eating disorders, especially with females. And Beth is doing that to focus more on her private practice. So again, the reason you're on the call today is to kind of just continue our conversation we had about suicide with the Female Athlete Summit. So let's get started and kind of get into what are some of the statistics on suicide?
So the suicide statistics are pretty shocking. Suicide ranks 10th as the course of death for human beings. It's the third leading cause of death for young people, which is, again, pretty shocking. And I think when young people kill themselves, everybody is up in arms and reacts very strongly, but suicide is pretty common. And I think that, again, until it hit like with Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade, people are like, suicide? Who commits suicide? But it happens all the time. People die of suicide. 38,000 people each year die of suicide.
So before we get into kind of how I feel like with the Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain suicide, I think, people really for a good week or two, that's all you kind of heard about. The news stations will post stuff. But before we get into that, and I completely actually lost my question. All right. So let's get into kind of the myths of suicide. Yeah. I know obviously with the recent suicides of these two individuals, there was a lot of stuff floating around, some that I didn't agree with because I've obviously had the benefit of talking to you, but kind of just touch on for everyone listening the myths.
Right. So I think that people believe sometimes that it's just one event that causes someone to commit suicide. It's not that never happens, but I think we're short-sighted to think that one thing can cause it. So for example, with Kate Spade, I know that there was talk about her getting divorced, but also with her, there was signs of depression, and she had struggled with depression for a long time. So I think one of the myths is that it's a one-shot deal. Something happens and people just try to commit suicide. The other thing is that people think that only white men commit suicide. I don't know why that's a myth. And that suicide comes without any warning, and that is so not true. Again, it's not that it never happens without warning, but in general, there are signs of people who have become suicidal. And one of the final myths I just want to talk about is that that talking about suicide with people will increase their possibility that they'll commit suicide. So many people come to me and say, I didn't want to ask because I was worried that would give them ideas. And one of the things we know in the mental health field is actually it helps to talk about this, that sometimes it can really help somebody not commit suicide by saying, have you ever thought about this? And are you getting help?
So I mean, I've known you for 10, 12 years, and I know that you work with your private practice with mental health issues. Why do you think it is in today's society that we don't want to have a conversation about mental health, whether it is, suicide or depression, or like I suffer from anxiety? Why is there this big stigmatism? Why do people not want to talk about it? I'm more asking for your expert opinion. There's no facts probably behind this, but I'm just curious what you think.
Right. I think it's partly because people with mental health illnesses still blame themselves, and that people think it's controllable. So what I do is I compare mental health to physical health. And if you broke your leg, everybody would be like, oh, how can I help you? Oh, you can't walk and you need all this. But with mental health, everybody, both individuals in the community, are like, just pick yourself up and start moving. I mean, I don't get depression. So I think people, I'm sorry to say, are really ignorant about mental health. And again, as a therapist, what I do is I say there's no difference between mental and physical health in terms of getting the support you need. So it's still a huge stigma in our society to be ill with mental health.
What do you think if, like, coaches, parents, athletes that are listening to this, what do you think are a few things they could do if they're listening to you and if they're an athlete and they're struggling right now with whether it's anxiety, depression, or they're having suicidal thoughts? What are some of the things you'd say to them? Like, what would you do? Like,
the first thing I would do is have a no judgment zone. That really the way you talk about mental health with your athletes is that this is a part of your growth and development, and that most people will struggle with some sort of anxiety, depression. I mean, I don't know anybody that has no anxiety and no depression. People go through different periods where they might be sad, or they might be anxious, or, they might be fearful of getting on a plane. And, so just normalizing that. I think in general, people who have mental health issues feel invisible. So I don't know why even a coach wouldn't say, very naturally, what, when I do this, I struggle. That normalizing the conversation, I think, is very important, so people don't feel what I call invisible. I specialize, in eating disorders, and I think so many people with eating disorders struggle with suicidality and depression, and it's rampant in the eating disorder field. And I think it's because people feel like their voices can't be heard. They're invisible, and that it's still stigmatized. So I think the best the coaches can do is say it is acceptable. I actually sometimes have struggles with this, and that we can talk about it.
I think a huge quality coaches can have in general, and parents, is relatability.
Exactly.
Right. I think you got to make sure you're relating to your athletes. So as you were just talking about, I have a question. So, I mean, look, I hate getting on planes. We all know that.
Exactly. That's why I used that example, Jen.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, look, I've been depressed, I have anxiety, but I would say I do not have a mental health issue. I mean, you know me. But if someone does have a mental health issue and then they have depression, they have anxiety, like, what's the difference from someone that's suffering from like a mental health kind of issue? They've been clinically, diagnosed, right. And then, kind of like the everyday person do you understand what I'm
right.
asking?
So here's what I believe. I believe that we're all on a continuum, like from 1 to 10 in terms of our mental health. And that we all try to stay in the 4 to 7 range. Sometimes when something's happening, we're in a relationship, we're moving up to 8 at the beginning, 9, And then sometimes something happens, there might be a death in our family, illness, and we're moving down to a 3, right? But people with mental health issues are going to stay at the 7, 8, and 9 stage for longer periods of time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, to me it does. I guess, the one thing that I read after the 2 suicides of Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain is like, well, I get depressed and I'm anxious, but I don't want to commit suicide. And I think what I was thinking when I read that was, well, you don't have a clinically diagnosed mental health. So when I get depressed, I might get down in the dumps for a few days, but there's never a thought of the extreme. And that's more what I wanted you to have the conversation about, is their brains, their activities
Right.
are a lot more extreme because they have been clinically diagnosed. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
And also, I think that I love that you mentioned brains, because our brain, there's a genetic component to mental health, and there are some people that are more apt to struggle with mental health. And that is the way we're learning so much about the brain activity. And so it's actually very exciting work to see what is happening in our brains. Where does the depression sit? Where does the anxiety sit? Now, again, there is a component, though, of untreated mental health that become more extreme. So if you, for example, have, as a child, you can't get on planes and you're forced to get on a plane every day, which probably wouldn't happen, or in a car, your mental health is going to suffer from that if you're not getting treated. So again, it's some of it is the social component, some of it is what happens with our brain, and some of it is really in our family system and in society, whether it's acceptable to get support and help.
God, like I said, that was one of the things I read soon after all this happened, and I was like, I feel like we need to distinguish and maybe have a conversation that my brain and someone else's brain, there's a huge difference in how we would process what's going on. So another thing that I read when Kate and Anthony's suicide happened is like, why would they do this? They had so much going for them. And I feel like in Massachusetts, we've had some kids suicide in the last couple of years. We've been hit pretty hard. And, some of them could be, a stud athlete. And the question, I can't believe they did that. And I would just love for you to kind of put some light in your expertise on why that is not the best way to think about what happened.
I think we actually have to think opposite of that. Like, people are at high risk when they're in the public eye. Okay. So I think that everybody looks, and they look at, actually, wealth is a big thing. Why would somebody so wealthy have so much want to kill themselves? Because actually it can be harder for them because they're in the public eye so much. So athletes, actually, particularly famous athletes, are at risk because everybody's watching, everybody's critiquing. People in the acting field, dancers, everybody's looking at every move they make and critiquing it. So if they have low self-esteem to begin with, they're going to be at higher risk. So I think that one of the things we need to do, Jen, is just be more authentic with people and not assume that people have it all, right?
Amen to that.
Not be shocked.
Amen to that, Beth. I think everyone needs to see them. We talked about this before, about how people identify, oh, you're a famous person, you're an actor, you're a chef. You're a person.
Exactly.
You have the same feeling. You and I, for the most part, feel the same, whether you work with eating disorders and I, work with athletes. And I think, again, when this came about, all these questions came out, and I just feel like what was being put on social media and out on the web, I'm like, I just don't feel like that's accurate information. And that's why I wanted to sit down and have this conversation with you.
Yeah.
So this is kind of broad topic because everyone needs to have this conversation about suicide, but let's kind of hone in now more with female athletes.
Yeah.
I know you do a ton of work with eating disorders with female athletes. Talk a little bit about why, if female athletes have an eating disorder, why they might be more of a risk for suicide.
Right. So I think female athletes really, really struggle, and they struggle, particularly when they're struggling with eating disorders. There's a pressure to continue to be an athlete because that's your status. That's how you identify yourself. And I'm sorry to say, many athletes have to stop being athletes in order to recover. So I think that one of the things with your athletes, if you're coaching, is to not just have them identify as an athlete. Who are they as a person, and what other qualities do they bring to the table? Because if somebody just identify with kind of one field, then that when they lose that, and many athletes do because of injury, we see these athletes who have MCL or ACL injuries and they can't perform for periods of time. And it's like, who am I without how I perform? So they're at really high risk, I think, for either suicidality or major depression or anxiety. And the other risk factor for athletes is that a lot of times they manage their symptoms of anxiety and depression through their athletic capacity. And actually, physiologically, exercise, is very good to manage depression and anxiety. So suddenly, if you're an athlete and you have stopped being able to do that, not only do you lose your identity, but you lose in some ways your coping mechanism for managing the depression and anxiety.
You know, it's funny you mentioned like injuries and ACLs, because I have been on a kick lately with kind of like blogging and emailing, talking to people, because the risk for females tearing their ACL is 9 times higher than a male. And every year it seems to it's going up by 3%. So, and most of the kind of the parents and coaches I talk to, when their athlete tears their ACL, I spoke to 2 parents this morning, they were just like, you know, it's been a really tough battle to get my daughter back. So
yeah,
it's this, you know, kind of interesting how you're saying it doesn't mean it's gonna tie into an eating disorder and just go down a path. But it's another thing to consider for all the athletes, coaches, and parents listening, that you don't want to tear your ACL for many reasons, but again, you have these risk factors. So what would we talked about, you know, kind of what coaches can do earlier about just being relatable, let their athletes talk about how they're feeling, kind of have an open field. Anything else you want to share to kind of coaches and parents listening about if they're concerned about their, you know, their kid, their athlete, how to have a conversation, what to do?
So there are 2 different parts. I just want to say, in terms of any concern about eating disorders, one of the things I've said on to you before, Jen, is that I really don't want coaches trying to tell people how to eat or what they should eat, because what I hear is a lot of athletes who have either had a nutritionist come in or a coach say, oh, that's good food, that's bad food. So we really want to not go into that area. People should be eating what their bodies need, and if they need additional help, referring out. In terms of what else coaches can do, I think that coaches need to understand that they are role models for their athletes. So how they manage themselves, their own issues, and how they talk to people, how they're building a relationship is so critical, because one of the kind of risk factors is connection around suicidality, depression, and anxiety. So, you know, I say I'm actually working with somebody who's a camp counselor. I said, do you know how important your role is with these kids that are 11 and 12? They look to you to know how to live in this world. And so I feel like, I'm sorry to put more pressure on coaches, but you have a critical role in how you help these young people develop who they want to be in this world.
Yeah, yes, I think coaches, teachers are some of the most important professions we have. I think a teacher or coach can change the outcome of what happens to a young athlete.
Right.
I 100% agree with that. So suicide happens. You know, we need to have that conversation. When it does happen, especially like with a young kid, athlete, what would be your recommendations or advice how to deal with it and how not to deal with it?
How not to deal with it is to say things like, this is an epidemic, this is horrible, you know, or we had no idea this was going to happen, I'm shocked. Never be shocked that suicide happens. I think letting particularly our athletes know this is life, and the way we can prevent it is by communicating and talking and not stigmatizing mental health. So I think that it's a wonderful opportunity to give a message in this world that no, we're not shocked that people are killing themselves. We get it. And this is a wonderful opportunity to talk as a team about, you know, why this is happening in this world. So I think using it as an opportunity rather than critiquing it or acting like it doesn't happen or being surprised by it.
Yeah. So you said, don't be shocked. Don't I know the other thing you've said to me in the past is you don't want a school to like memorialize
exactly
the athlete, the student, and explain why, please.
I think having a permanent memorial is not a good idea because it's always a reminder. I think it's fine to put flowers or to do things, but you know, that aren't permanent. But in my experience with suicide, having permanent memorials can have a negative overtone for people. And also remember that suicide, we don't want to have other people think that suicide is a good thing or, oh, if I'm thinking about suicide, then they'll do this for me, right? this is how people will remember me, because that's a lot of kind of the fantasizing about suicide. If you think about suicide, I know anybody that's ever thought about killing themselves is like, everybody will feel bad at my funeral, right? Or they'll, people will, miss me. And again, it's not that that's not true, but you don't want to have people think I need to kill myself so people will care.
Thankfully, I've never had those thoughts, so I can't relate there. I can relate to a lot of things female athlete goes through. This is not one of them, and that is why I want to have a conversation with you. You are, you've dealt with a lot of this. You have some experience. So to wrap up this call, if anyone wants to reach out to you because they have questions, they need to be connected to another organization or someone maybe in their area, where can they find you, Beth?
The two organizations are Meta, www.metainc.org, and the Samaritans are amazing in Boston. And I actually personally support them too. They have a great hotline for teens. They have a texting teen hotline. There are so many resources for particularly kids and adults.
And do you know off the top of your head what's
I don't have it, but if you Google Samaritans, I just didn't have it with me. But I think that they have a 24-hour hotline. And I actually have a lot of people who are training in the mental health field that work on those hotlines, and it's a wonderful experience.
Nice. So on a side note, before Beth and I wrap up, just kind of speaking to everyone that's listening, Beth mentioned that, coaches should be doing this and doing that, and coaches have a lot going on. They need to train these athletes. They need to, make sure they're performing on the field. And that's why we have this inner circle where you can go into the vault and you can get information on Beth, who's talking about suicide, or another conversation, she's talking about eating disorders. There's other conversations about mental toughness. There's conversations about everything. And it's kind of the goal with this is to educate the coach, the athlete, and the parent. Because in today's society, there's a lot going on and you need to be educated and you need to be relatable. So that was just my spiel about the female athlete inner circle. So Beth, as we wrap up this call, is there anything else you want to talk about before we close this out?
I would just say that the reason I think people become coaches is very personal. And so do take the time to kind of look into these resources and make sure you're doing due diligence to the people you're coaching, because athletes become good athletes because of their mental stability. And so you really want to make sure that you know how important you are to these kids and these adults, and that you take the time to learn about everybody individually.
Very well said. Perfect way to close out. Just as everyone, we should focus obviously on our physical well-being, but we need to take time to work on our mental well-being. So Beth, I will see you tomorrow, but it's always a pleasure to talk to you outside of the gym and talk about something other than lifting kettlebells. So thank you again for your time.
Thanks, Jen. Take care. Bye-bye, everybody.